Legends are cemented over early graves. Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix, Amy Winehouse, Lane Staley. There's something about going out at the height of your powers, or better yet, in your ascendance, that makes you immortal in the human imagination. Today's episode of Strength Stories requires you to get out your lighters and slowly brandish them. Jón Páll Sigmarsson died prematurely, but he'd already tugged and screamed and shoved his way into the acropolis of strength sports history. Bill Kazmaier set aside unresolved childhood trauma to shake hands with him. We're talking about the walking He-Man cosplay, the lad who took a Husafell stone as his dance partner, the burly blonde behemoth that Hulk Hogan and Chris Hemsworth could only ever aspire to imitate. Without Sigmarsson, there would be no Half-Thor Bjornsson. There would be no Magnus Ver Magnusson. Skyr would continue to ferment in Scandinavian secret, and Iceland itself would probably have been subsumed by the wrongly beautiful eruption of some unpronounceable volcano. But for the 34 years that Sigmarsson shook this fragile earth, even the most colicky infants slept soundly in their pagan cribs. We're talking about the literal son of Sigmar. But if I keep working myself up, I'll have to stop recording to wait out my refractory period. Suffice to say that Sigmarsson lived his life large and hard from the day he came shrieking into this mortal plane. Jón Páll Sigmarsson was born on the 28th of April in the year 1960, already weighing a precocious 4 kilos. Though he took his surname from his biological father Sigmar, he was raised by his foster father Svein and his mother Dora. Jón Páll spent most of his formative years in Reykjavik and the island of Skyr, where he passed summers slinging hay bales from dawn until dusk in a season-long GPP phase that would make Bromley proud. Keep in mind that Iceland is awfully close to the upper pole, so the phrase dawn until dusk takes on a more substantial meaning. When the northern sun took its brief hiatus, Jón Páll and his foster dad would tiptoe up on seals and bash their brains in with clubs. Before you woke bastards go all Greenpeace on me, consider that doing so is culturally insensitive to the long-standing Icelandic tradition of doing whatever the fuck is necessary in order to eat. You think those giant pale fuckers are gnawing on whale blubber by choice? It's awfully hard to go vegan when you've got a 2-month growing season. Try having a modicum of empathy for your own goddamn species. If your hypogonadal jimmies are still rustled, I sincerely hope your bleeding heart cognitive dissonance gives you an aneurysm. But let's get back to Johnny Boy. Bashing seals wasn't this lad's only traditional practice. He was an ace at the Nordic folk wrestling style of Gilma, which requires at least 4 forms of fire breathing. He was also a furious karate practitioner. I'd have loved to see him walk into Rex Kwon Do's studio and mog the shit out of the sensei. John also applied that conditioning gained from slinging hay bales as a swimmer, middle distance runner, footballer, and handballer. He was introduced to weightlifting at the entirely reasonable age of 16, joining the legendary Icelandic gym Jakoball 2 years later. By 1984, the 24-year-old Sigmarsson was oiling himself up and busting out of a thong to secure the Icelandic heavyweight bodybuilding title. That same year, he set a European powerlifting record in the 125-plus kilogram class. In fact, Sigmarsson set streaks of them. Though he held plenty of unprecedented marks in the squat and bench, his most exceptional performances came in the deadlift. He was a multiple-time European record holder, pulling 370 kilograms in competition. That's 816 American pounds for you xenophobic Republicans. Keep in mind that a deadlift at the end of a powerlifting meet is an entirely different experience than a strapped-up bumper-plated pool noodle bar sumo gym PR. It's the equivalent of comparing Ron Jeremy's flaccid length to your bathmate and Viagra-enhanced erection. Sorry, buddy, it's just not the same thing. There's a reason you never see your favorite TikTok deadlift specialists tugging conventional on a stiff bar. Except Jamal Browner, but he's God. Case in point, if I huffed some ammonia and strapped up, I could deadlift about 550 pounds, which Sigmarsson literally pulled with one hand. The whole time Jón Páll was getting up to these shenanigans, he was also gaining world renown as a strongman. In his precocious debut at the 1983 World's Strongest Man, he placed second behind the bushy Brit Jeff Capes. The following year, the two men faced off in the final arm wrestling event, which went down like a Stallone screenplay. With Sigmarsson's knuckles practically grazing the table, Capes gave one final, forearm-tearing yank. Jón Páll slammed his injured rival's hand to the hardwood and bellowed, Sigmarsson and Capes would trade the title back and forth over the following 2 years.
He's an animal. And he asked him what he thought of me. He said, he's an animal too. So, but it's the same old thing, you know. When two animals get together, there's hell to play.
Their victories were darkened by Bill Kazmaier's long shadow. The outspoken American had been deprived of an invite after quite literally winning too many times. In 1987, Sigmarsson, Capes, and Kazmaier kilted up and faced off for the pure strength competition in Scotland. On the highly paintable grounds of Huntly Castle, Jón Páll won 8 of the 10 events. Locking out the 1,003-pound pool that secured him his title, Sigmarsson shouted,
"My and to be alive if you can't do deadlift!"
His victory was corroded by Kazmaier's rust. The American was fresh off a stint as a professional wrestler and only recently returned to strength training. The 1998 World's Strongest Man saw the two facing off on more even footing. Kazmaier, whose powerlifting records surpassed even Sigmarsson, dominated the static lifts. A strategically slimmer Sigmarsson made his mark in the moving events. Though Kazmaier bested Sigmarsson in the deadlift, log lift, and sack race, dead serious, the Icelander's performances in the weight over bar and the McLaughlin stones, a smooth prototype to the modern Atlas, secured him the title, matching Kazmaier's 3 World's Strongest Man victories. Though Sigmarsson could get overcome by his vigor, he wasn't shy about displaying respect for his more seasoned competitor. Descending from the podium, Jón Páll told the press that he might be the fastest strongman in the world, but Bill Kazmaier was the strongest on his feet. In 1990, Sigmarsson pushed through injury to secure his 4th World's Strongest Man title. Once again, his conditioning was what earned him the win. Jón Páll was trailing O.D. Wilson going into the final event, a 200-meter race carrying 100 kilograms. In that hypothetical Stallone screenplay treatment, Jón Páll would flash back to summers sucking wind, seal bashing, and hay baling while he toasted the heavier Wilson. The sheer GPP on this man. I don't think I'm projecting too hard when I say that Bromley probably thinks about it to finish. By 1990, recurring injuries had limited Jón Páll's performances on the moving events, so he shifted his focus back to static strength. When Kazmaier took the world deadlift record at an exhibition, Jón Páll snatched it back with a 942-pound pull in front of a hometown crowd at his gym. By this time, his fellow countryman Magnus Ver Magnusson was outperforming him in strongman competition. Magnusson would go on to match, but not exceed, Sigmarsson's 4 World's Strongest Man titles. In January of my birth year, 1993, Jón Páll ruptured his aorta deadlifting. Though the press tried to pin his death on steroids, actual medical professionals pointed to a congenital heart defect. Those close with Sigmarsson claimed he was aware of the condition and had planned a trip to the U.S. to seek treatment. He left behind a wife, a 10-year-old son, and a horde of friends and fans who would immortalize his passion in the pursuit of peak strength. Jón Páll Sigmarsson was a gym owner, a father, a mascot for Skyr, and a prototype for athletic and mobile strongmen like Alexei Novikov and Martins Lassis. His many records are dwarfed by his showmanship and competitive flair. His substantial spirit watches over all who mount the platform. When you hump up a grinder of a deadlift, you'd best believe that's Sigmarsson giving your glutes a shove to earn you the lockout. So get yourself a stiff bar and start tugging in honor of this blonde behemoth. Thanks for watching. In the words of the immortal Miyamoto Musashi, seek nothing outside yourself except a like, a subscribe, and a comment.